Ecossaise, we are introduced to the world of the swordmaster through our narrator Robert Meldrum. In his meeting with Hamilton, Hamilton introduces Meldrum to the weapons which form the basis of swordsmanship in early modern Europe. We learn that this is just a matter of refamiliarization for Meldrum, as in a previous life, Meldrum was a young swordmaster in Edinburgh before he had an accident. However, at this stage, Meldrum does not detail what this accident was, but we do know that it was serious enough for him to make a pledge to himself not to go near a sword again. We also know that Hamilton is aware of this, but is encouraged by the fact that Meldrum's eyes light up when he sees the swords on the table. It is clear that Meldrum still had his passion for swordsmanship. Hamilton has an example of each weapon lying on the table, as well as a pile of printed military and swordsmanship treaties for Meldrum to read after the meeting. On the table there were 3 weapons. Firstly, a dagger, which was used alongside the rapier for defence and attack, and the 2-handed sword, a large heavy sword which, as the name suggests, was used with both arms. In the latter case, we know that Hamilton would not use his in combat, and it has become highly ornamental, which was representative of the general trend in early modern warfare for weapons to become lighter and more agile as time progressed. Indeed, we learn that Hamilton's 2-handed sword matched its owner, heavier and larger than average, and that Hamilton operated the sword with ease. This feeds into Hamilton's reputation as this larger-than-life invincible warrior. This was taken straight from the legends that surround the real-life Gallic warrior Alistair MacColla himself. Legend has it that MacColla had a sword that was as large as the man himself, which fed into MacColla's reputation as a fierce soldier. It is no coincidence in the Garde Ecossaise that the islanders of Colonsay, MacColla's native island, forged Hamilton's sword for him in gratitude for his services on the island. After the basic introduction to some weaponry, we are then briefly introduced to the various schools of swordsmanship in early modern Europe, such as the Italian school, the Spanish school, and the French school. Each school had its different techniques and approaches to sword fighting. I will now introduce the major schools of swordsmanship in early modern Europe. There were several schools of swordsmanship within Europe during the early modern period. These schools were run by fencing masters, who taught their pupils the art of swordsmanship. Swordsmanship was considered an art form, or a highly acquired skill that could only be taught by fencing masters. The title fencing master was usually bestowed on someone with many years of experience, in addition to passing several examinations and tests. In an English tract called The Third University, dated 1615, it details how pupils were admitted as scholars, like today's undergraduates at university. They aimed to earn their degrees as provosts of defence, which would be the equivalent of an undergraduate degree. In order to become a provost, scholars had to show proficiency in their weapons in prize fights in front of hundreds of people. Then these provosts could aim to become a master of science of defence or the title of fencing master. In order for this title to be bestowed, the provost had to sit a viva, or as the author puts it, public acts and trials, after which the fencing masters would choose whether or not to elect that person amongst their own company or corporation. Many of these established corporations had royal assent. Other evidence from Spanish sources suggests that the title Master of the Sword was a title of privilege and status. Appointing someone to the corporation was a matter completed after much thought and consideration. Fencing tuition was an international affair and highly competitive. We know that Italians, Spaniards and Frenchmen taught fencing in London. In France, French schools of fencing did not emerge until the 17th century. Until that point, Italians dominated the fencing schools in France, and there were likely Spanish masters too who taught swordsmanship to courtiers during the reign of Louis XIII. It was during the reign of Louis XIV in 1656 that the Académie des Armes was conferred letters of royal patent, and 6 masters were granted titles and elected to the nobility. The king also stipulated that should one of these 6 men die, they should be replaced by a master with at least 20 years of experience, thus ensuring the high levels of experience and professionalism that became a hallmark of the institution. Furthermore, no one was allowed to teach fencing within the Kingdom of France without having attended the Académie des Armes. There were several schools or methods of swordsmanship throughout Europe in the early modern period. The first was the Italian school, which emerged in the 16th century, although later it was surpassed by the emerging Spanish school and ultimately the French school, but the Italian school remained the foundation upon which these later schools rested. A French school of swordsmanship began to emerge with the publication of Tracés, Contraintes et Secrets du premier livre sur l'épée seule mais de toutes les armes by Henri de Saint-Didier. Indeed, this is one of the texts that Meldrum is given to read by Hamilton for his own interest and instruction. Its importance cannot be overstated. To quote Edgerton Castle, this book is looked upon by the French as the first treatise on an art which they consider essentially their own. However, the book drew heavily from Italian publications on fencing, which is unsurprising since Saint-Didier was from Provence. It is also no coincidence that the book was published during the French Wars of Religion, a conflict which had torn France apart, and given the circumstances, this made the publication a huge success. Saint-Didier's work was illustrated with 64 woodcuts, hand-carved illustrations created by a wooden block, which would have been expensive to produce, but would have allowed both master and provost the ability to easily understand the instructions. The courteous salute before all bouts, which you will be familiar with having watched The Three Musketeers, was certainly a French invention, and the handling of the rapier in both hands grew popular in France during the second half of the 17th century. The very distinctive school of Spanish swordsmanship emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, and largely remained unchanged throughout the early modern period. This school of swordsmanship put an emphasis on the science of swordsmanship rather than viewing it as an art. Thus, in the Spanish school, the emphasis was on the anatomy of your opponent and the various points to strike them with a sword, similar to pressure points for self-defense today. The emphasis was also on geometry and natural philosophy. Angles, arcs, tangents, and circles all underpinned Spanish swordplay. Carranza and Narvaez dominate Spanish swordsmanship throughout the 17th century, and therefore, unlike other European schools of swordsmanship, it evolved throughout the century. But do not be deceived, as the Spanish were very dangerous and feared swordsmen, and had a reputation of keeping a cool head under the most immense pressures. Yet there is another school of swordsmanship to discuss in this context, and it is the Hispano-French school of fencing, which emerged out of the Spanish Netherlands. The text to the Academy of the Sword was written by Gerard Thriboust, who was based in Antwerp. Like the Spanish school, it was underpinned by scientific and mathematical principles, but it also drew upon Italian and French principles as well. There was a fencing academy in Brussels, which would have been heavily influenced by Spain, but within France itself there was also the Academy of Toulouse, which, due to its proximity to Spain, drew upon Spanish fashions in swordsmanship. There were also German, English, and Scottish schools of fencing, which will be discussed in future podcasts. We must keep in mind that swords had different functions and purposes in war and peace. There was a division between military swords and those swords that people wore as part of their court dress, either as part of their status as a gentleman or for private defence if need be. Although I must stress that duelling was forbidden under Louis XIV, both for private persons and members of the armed forces. Now we will also briefly look at some of the key swords of the 17th century. The first sword that we will look at is the two-handed sword. Although this sword is more associated with an earlier period, and it was largely out of fashion as it had been replaced by lighter blades, the two-handed sword was still used in the 17th century. Indeed, a printed manual on the two-handed sword was published by Alfieri in 1653. The next sword was the rapier, and to quote Egerton Castle in his superb book on fencing schools and fencing masters, he states that the rapier was elegant and vicious. Alfred Hutton, who wrote a short definitive account of old swordsplay in the 19th century, stated that the rapier was long and handsome, and became a favoured weapon in the first half of the 17th century. Indeed, as Hamilton was of that generation, we are told that the rapier was his favourite sword. It is described as a long double-edged weapon. Indeed, we are also told that it is Meldrum's favourite weapon also, which is curious, given that Meldrum was of a younger generation. One can only assume at this stage that Meldrum was taught swordsmanship from his own father, who is the same generation as Hamilton, and I'm trying to avoid spoilers here. The rapier itself went through an evolution between 1625 and 1660, becoming lighter and shorter, allowing it to be easily transferred between the left and right hands in a fight. A rapier was used by the military, but it was also used as a sword, worn daily by non-military persons in case of trouble. The rapier also was associated with the aristocracy. The next weapon to discuss is the broadsword. This was absent from Hamilton's collection of swords, and I am again avoiding spoilers. Nevertheless, the broadsword was used during the 17th century. It was short, it was wide and double-edged, and was the standard military weapon. The next weapon to consider is the dagger. Although daggers became unfashionable during the first half of the 17th century, it was used alongside the rapier for defence. It was particularly useful in close combat. Finally, the small sword took over from the rapier in the later 17th century and was essentially a French weapon taught by French masters. Louis XIV's army, like other armies of their time, comprised of different regiments with different functions and specialities, which called for the use of specific weapons. The fictional Garde Ecossaise is situated mainly within the Maison le Roi, which comprised of a number of regiments which made up the king's bodyguard. In this context, the sword served as a ceremonial function, as well as a weapon of defence. It was the duty of the men in the elite Maison le Roi to carry the king's food to the table with sword in hand. In addition, the elite bodyguard were also given swords and carbines for defence purposes. Other regiments were known for their use of swords too. The gendarmes were armed with swords as well. A mark of the grenadiers à cheval de la garde, which distinguished them from other regiments, were their sabre swords, which had a curved shape. For the Gendarmerie de la France, swords were also a standard issue for all members of the gendarmerie, as well as pistols and rifled carbines. It should also be no surprise that the sword was a standard issue amongst soldiers in Louis XIV's field armies, those large-scale armies mobilised to fight for the king both at home and abroad. Interestingly, for some parts of the line infantry, such as those who carried muskets, they also carried a sword on their person, as a means of defence in hand-to-hand combat in battle, since they were not issued with body armour. As expected, in common with many other early modern armies, the sword was the dominant weapon of the line cavalry. It was such an important weapon that the army stipulated its length to be 89.3 centimetres long. The guard was to be made of brass, and before 1684 it was to be carried on a buff shoulder belt, and after 1684 it was carried on a waist belt. Swords were to be worn on the left side of the body. We must also keep in mind that Louis XIV's army contained many different men of many different nationalities, including Scots, Irish, English, German, Swiss and Hungarians, to name but a few, who brought with them their own national traditions of instruction, sword fighting and equipment experience. Louis XIV's army was an international entity, containing some of the best swordsmanship from across Europe, not just France. Louis XIV was interested in investing in and distributing state-of-the-art equipment to his armies. This was facilitated by the creation of a central administration system during the War of Devolution, which sought to procure, organise and distribute weapons and equipment to soldiers. Regarding specific bladed weapons, the rapier was to be used to fight single opponents in combat, in other words, hand-to-hand combat, and it was often found to be of use in duelling contests. Louis XIV specifically clamped down on such contests, seeing them as a symptom of ill discipline within the army. In the world of Garde Ecossaise, Hamilton indicates that the rapier is used. Of course, these men, being part of a secret unit akin to modern-day special forces, hand-to-hand combat is a key feature in their ways of fighting. During Louis XIV's reign, there were efforts to try and develop the use of the sword by the cavalry, by moving from a straight blade to the curved sabre to allow more cutting and slashing rather than the stabbing actions by a straight blade. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Garde Ecossaise podcast. Don't forget that you can purchase the historical fiction novel from all good bookstores. Next week we will take a look at muskets and the world of the skilled marksman. Until then, au revoir, à bientôt. Sound files, courtesy of P. Franzen and Edu La Clava via Freesound.
This podcast is the copyright of History Gateway Limited, UK.